At the end of the day, we want to see true, good, scientifically valid outcomes for both clean, reliable, renewable energy and biodiversity. And to do that, we have to do good science. Like, we have to really understand the facts of what we're dealing with so that we can do the engineering that we can do to create solutions that deliver results for both power and for fish.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. We take salmon recovery seriously here at Northwest River Partners. Yes, we're a, quote, hydropower advocacy organization, but did you know we actually started out as the Coalition for Smart Salmon Recovery? I personally didn't because I was actually still in grade school at the time, but it's true. While a lot has changed over our history as an organization, the coexistence of salmon and hydropower is core to our work. We haven't talked fish nearly enough on the DAM podcast, but we've mentioned fish-friendly turbine upgrades numerous times and recently included them in our broader discussion on Hydropower 101 on our episode on fish passage. Today, we're going to change that, and we're going to take a deep dive into the subject with one of the leaders in cutting-edge fish passage technology, Natel, with none other than their CEO and co-founder herself, Gia Schneider. Gia, it's an honor to talk with you today.
Thank you, Austin. It's a real pleasure. Appreciate the opportunity to join this podcast and share a little bit about the work we're doing, and I think some of the things that we can really do to have a sustainable future for both salmon and hydropower.
Absolutely. There's a lot of work to be done there, as I'm sure you're well aware. And I think the thing I just want to kick us off with and help our listeners better understand is the backstory of Natel and maybe a bit of your role in founding the organization or the business as well.
Yeah, so the backstory of Natel is that my brother and I actually co-founded it. We both happen to be engineers. I was a chemical engineer. He's a mechanical engineer. He really is the person who's driven the technology innovation that we've developed around fish safe high performance turbines. My background has been really more on renewable energy from an investment and financing and deployment perspective. And what fascinated us about hydropower is that as we make this clean energy transition that we really must make, hydro is kind of this resource that is fundamental. Every place, every grid that you have hydropower and you have increasing deployments of intermittent renewables like wind and solar, hydro is the resource alongside natural gas that's dispatching to keep the grid reliable. And so we felt that it was this like just such a critical resource for us to invest in, particularly given the fact that we also have this aging fleet that is in need of modernization and upgrades. And that combined with a personal passion that we have for, we both spend a lot of personal time on the water with water sports and rivers. My brother's an avid fly fisherman. And so we have this personal interest in rivers and in water and an awareness about some of the challenges we face from a biodiversity perspective. And so hydropower was this like really interesting way for us to focus and bring together two things we deeply care about, which is, clean energy transition and accelerating that, but also doing things that help improve the health of river ecosystems.
And I think sometimes people maybe get the misconception that those of us who enjoy water sports or, activities on rivers and things like that are just at default at odds with hydropower. And, speaking as someone who enjoys particularly kayaking and fishing, and ideally both at the same time.
Yeah.
I certainly understand where you guys are coming from the perspective of, we want to enjoy these resources, but also we enjoy having our clean, reliable energy.
Absolutely. And I think that's where perhaps we really brought an engineering mindset to the problem, which is at the end of the day, as engineers, we really focus on creating solutions, right? And I think, there's so many examples over our history as a nation where when we have put our minds to solving a problem from the perspective of like, we care about, being clear about the outcomes we care about. And so in this case, that we really want to have a robust, reliable, clean energy grid. We also want healthy river ecosystems. Then it's just a matter of saying, okay, as engineers, how do we, put really smart folks to work to solve for both of those outcomes, as opposed to kind of locking ourselves into something where we assume we have, inevitably we can only choose one. And that doesn't just that when I'm not trying to say that everything's win-win 100% in all cases, but that there are real compromise solutions that are good across the board.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I think it's the mindset that we all probably need to have if we want to find real solutions. I think a lot of people that we've spoken to on this podcast have shared similar sentiments when it comes to maybe more of the policy side of things. But at the end of the day, if we can find solutions that are of the mindset of let's try and balance needs rather than put all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, puts us in a much better position.
Yeah, and it's kind of very natural. Like, it's very easy to go that from a first principles and a personal perspective. Like, nobody likes to be, if you're in the situation where you were told like you just get to lose or you only get to win. I mean, maybe if you were in the situation where you were told you only get to win, you would say that's okay. But I think we have an inherent, each of us have an inherent sense that there's fairness and that there are, again, compromises. But I think really the piece that we have really really worked hard as a team to bring to the table is putting a very high standard on both the power generation outcomes and the fish passage outcomes. And that by doing so, it actually has driven some very innovative thinking that would not otherwise have happened if we had set ourselves a lower bar. I don't think we would have been as innovative. And I think that's another kind of something that we've seen repeatedly again in other disciplines and other technology innovations as well.
You mentioned that you had this background a little bit in renewable energy prior to Natel. I'd love to learn just a little bit more briefly about kind of what that looked like and maybe, how some of that has tied into obviously the perspectives you've been able to develop now.
Yeah. So my career arc was, basically it was, again, engineering, MIT, came out of school really focused on energy, climate change and energy. So I went to work for Accenture as part of their utility practice. That gave me a really interesting broad exposure to a number of different utility companies and the challenges they were facing in the late 90s, early 2000s across the US. And then from there, went to join Constellation Energy, which was a merchant generator based on the East Coast. And after that, ended up at Credit Suisse as part of there was a wave of kind of banks getting into the energy space and in the early 2000s. And so I had a stint there. And what kind of that trajectory was all grounded in really trying to understand, how are decisions made and what drives decision making and investment in our energy sector. And that relates then when my brother and I had the opportunity to start Natel, that really, again, it was critical to informing the perspective of in our energy sector, as we make this transition to a clean energy grid, we really take so much for granted every day in this country because we have such a reliable grid, right? And that's the way it should be. Like, the average person doesn't have to think about, where electricity comes from, and that in general is a good thing. But at the same time, what that has led to is we as we dug into the problem set, we're like, there's just this big area of underappreciated asset space in hydropower, where, again, if you stack up the energy generation characteristics of hydro against the other resources that are out there, it's basically hydro and gas that are your, natural gas that are your most flexible power generation assets that can respond long duration timeframes, on short duration timeframes, with a variety of the different, technical grid stability elements. And that is, we've benefited from that, frankly, in a number of grids in the country as we've made this first wave of integration of intermittent renewables. And none of this is a negative against any of the intermittent renewables. It's just that to make this clean energy transition, we need to have the types of grid services that hydro is able to provide. And I know I'm going back. So I think that was really from that really just came out of kind of that arc of consulting with a number of utilities, then working at an independent power producer, and then finally, coming at it from the financing perspective as well.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think it does obviously help frame today's conversation and help people understand Natel's perspective and the sort of guidance and the direction that you all are working towards and the goals that you've set. As far as the conversation today goes, I do want to switch gears just a little bit abruptly, because I think that the elephant in the podcast room right now, or the virtual podcast space where people are streaming from, is that we've used this term a lot, fish-friendly turbine. I've said it on numerous podcasts prior, and it's been brought up by other guests and things like that. But I'm not sure that even in trying to describe it at like a 101 level, like I have on one of those episodes, that our listeners fully understand what is a fish-friendly turbine, or in your case, I believe it's actually, you use the term fish safe. So I'd love to know from your own perspective what a fish safe turbine is, and maybe also what makes a normal turbine not fish safe.
Excellent question. So maybe first I'll give the context around fish friendly. So the idea of fish-friendly turbines is something that's been around for a while. So it really was work that was kicked off in the mid-90s by the Department of Energy and an industry group called Ep.34 that is a conglomeration of utilities in the U.S., actually also in North America. And it came out of the fact that, to the second question you asked, that conventional turbines, the reason why they are not necessarily fish friendly is because conventional turbines are designed with fairly thin blades, and those thin blades move fairly quickly. And the reason why they move fast is just simply when you're really trying to get, from a power engineering perspective, you want things to spin as fast as possible, because fast spinning things have smaller generators. And so all of your equipment then to generate electricity becomes more compact and less expensive, that to a certain extent linked to this like idea of speed. The other thing that lends to the speed question is that as we build larger machines, I have larger diameter, they're just bigger around. And if you've ever been on a merry-go-round, you know that if you're at the center of the merry-go-round, you don't move that fast. But if you're out at the hub of the merry-go-round, you're moving faster. And so as you get to bigger machines, your tip speeds out at the tips also get quite fast. And so that's just why, like, I don't want to oversimplify it by saying it's kind of like knives moving quickly, but that's not a completely wrong, like it's not like 100% a wrong analogy to make. And so that's why conventional turbines just in general have suffered from, unfortunately, having some bad impacts on fish that go through. So then this effort in the mid-90s was established to say, okay, can we make turbines more friendly? And what came out of that work was really two different things. One was an effort to reduce the gaps, so the places in a turbine between the edge of the blades and the housing that goes around the turbines, to minimize places where fish could get pinched or trapped and things like that, which is all really good. And that definitely helps. It helps on helps to improve fish safety. And the other effort started but didn't. We think we really see our work as kind of complete as building off of the idea of there've been some work that started to say, could we change the shape of the leading edge? Could we make that leading edge a little bit thicker? And by doing so, therefore have, instead of having a thin blade moving fast, have a thicker leading edge, and that thicker leading edge has a lower impact on fish. But that effort, unfortunately, didn't go to as far as it needed to, and frankly, stalled a bit, I would say, between the mid 2000s and early 2010s, because some of the initial designs that used that idea were designs that fundamentally had lower efficiency and spun a lot more slowly. And in the context of an existing fleet that has a lot of existing investment in it, changing those two things all of a sudden means, in theory, you could deploy it, but practical reality, it's too expensive. Like, it requires completely like tearing out old plants and putting in new plants. And it just is not something that actually worked from an economic viability perspective for the industry. And so we took those early efforts, and they absolutely have informed our work. And what we have done, and the reason why we talk about what we do as fish safe, is to distinguish from fish friendly, because there is prior work, and because one of our key engineering kind of goals was that we would deliver world-class power performance, so 90 to 94% efficient machines, and that we would have 99%, 98, 99% safe passage of fish. And those are the kind of the metrics that we design around. We achieve that through basically having a very thick leading edge. So the early folks were on to something there. So we have a thick leading edge, and that thick leading edge basically creates think of it as like it's not an airbag, obviously, more like a water bag, a stagnation zone in front of the blade, and that deflects fish around the blade as opposed to having direct strike. And then we swoop the leading edge. So as you move from the hub to the tip, there's a forward swoop or slant to the blade. And that deal helps us maintain a constant low mortality rate from hub to tip of fish. And it's just to deal with this fact that the tips move more quickly. And those two things are the core of what makes our turbines fish safe. Is leading edge design. And then the rest of the blade shape is optimized for power generation, performance, and cavitation, things that are critical to have a high performing turbine. And the last part of this is that this design approach, so it's not a single design, it's really a design approach. And that is necessary because that's what allows us to design turbines that can go into the existing plants today, because they can match the existing equipment, whether it's generators, water passageway. There's all sorts of technical stuff around what the existing equipment that's perfectly good. We want to reuse that existing equipment. We just want to go through a modernization process where we replace old turbines, old, blades with new blades that are frankly going to be more efficient than the old blades that are there, but also now pass fish safely.
Yeah, and that's where you get into, I think, what you were talking about, where I think you can actually really consider this a win-win scenario, as opposed to, it's better for fish, but it's worse for power, or it's worse for fish, better for power.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is another piece, frankly, for hydro more broadly, that is another reason why, philosophically we like this space, is that so much of what we can do with hydro is about reuse, right? It's about recycling. It's like taking this existing infrastructure and making very targeted investments in it. And then, this is it. In the Northwest, it's infrastructure that enabled the U.S. to frankly help win World War II. And that's incredible that now, however many years on from World War II we are, we're able to make these very targeted investments in this existing infrastructure and have it power another, many decades of clean energy, reliable energy, and we think now also a sustainable future. Not just in the Northwest, but obviously across, but in the context of the Northwest specifically.
Legend has it, and I could not verify this online, I did my best searching on Google, YouTube, everything like that to see if I could find anything. But legend has it that at some point, decades and decades ago, somebody produced an anti-hydro ad where they had a fish going through a blender. And that was supposed to represent what fish going through the turbines did, which we know is not the case. But just to kind of further clarify and maybe understand how this technology works and also how fish interact with a going through a hydropower facility and actually passing through the turbine. As I understand it, the primary issue is the concussive force. I think you described, a strike. It's not like the blades are spinning so fast in this thing that it's just grinding everything up that goes through there. It's more just it's heavy, it's large, it's still moving fast enough that it can cause a, potentially damaging or fatal impact. And that, as you mentioned, the blade design you've come up with at Natel is creating a sort of safe space within the generator, within the turbine, where that same force isn't being applied, and they can be just simply sort of directed in the right direction to the outflow of the dam and continue on their way downriver.
Yeah. So actually, if folks want to see fish passing through our turbines, you can go to our website. We have a lot of videos on our website with that show our high-speed video that shows many different species of fish going through our test turbine. We've tested at this point with American eel, with rainbow trout, with actually Chinook salmon smolt, bass, perch, sturgeon, like catfish, we've done many different species at this point. And what you can see from those passage videos is that, fish enter the turbine. Some of them are swimming downstream in their orientation. Some of them look like they're swimming upstream in their orientation. So kind of, they come in oriented in however they happen to be oriented in the intake flow. And then how they pass through the turbine is somewhat tied to the physical characteristics of the fish. So small fish, small compact fish tend to, will sometimes just kind of pass through the turbine without actually having many direct encounters with the blade. Eel, which are long, have a long kind of form factor. Particularly, we've done tests where we literally had eel that were longer than the diameter of the turbine we were testing. And in that case, they're definitely coming in contact with the blades, and you can see that in the video. And that's really where kind of the critical elements of how we've designed the blade. If the blade were thin, you would see, frankly, and you can see this, there is documented evidence of eel, seeing true severing injuries in certain cases in the field. But you can kind of that's like a very easy, kind of very clear way to demonstrate that in this case. It's the blade shape really does contribute to like it's a very intuitive, easy kind of thing to understand, like how the blade is, because you can just see the eel are being struck by the blade. And so bottom line is different fish move through there's a lot of things that drive how fish move through the turbines. And I think one of the places where we've really helped contribute to the science is actually capturing lots of very high quality scientific data documenting how fish go through, in this case, just our turbine, and then working to have that research published in, very respected peer-reviewed fisheries journals. And I think that's the other piece that's really critical here, because at the end of the day, again, coming back to where we started, which is we want to see true, good, scientifically valid outcomes for both clean, reliable, renewable energy and biodiversity. And to do that, we have to do good science. Like, we have to really understand the facts of what we're dealing with so that we can do the engineering that we can do to create solutions that deliver results for both power and for fish. Your first question about blenders, I mean, the thing is again, it's size dependent. If you have, very large fish going through a small turbine, you get an effect that is probably going to look a lot more like a blender than large fish, than very small fish going through a very large turbine. And again, so I think this is where sometimes there's this urge to simplify things, but where again, you just have to do good science. And if you do good science and good work, we can solve the problems by applying good science and engineering rigor to how we are designing things, what we are designing, how we test them, how we prove both the power side results and the fish side results.
I think that something too that's important to our conversation is, we often, I think, particularly Northwest River Partners and others in our region, are approaching it from this perspective of salmon smolt recovery in particular and their migration. And so these types of things, like the blender example, or we're talking about extremely, on the very large end of turbines and the very small end of fish. But to your point, yeah, there's other fish species out there. There's other hydropower projects out there, and you all are not working specifically just on our issues here in our neck of the woods. And so it makes sense that you would have to look at it from all angles and perspectives. And you mentioned a lot of different fish species in that example. And that was something I did want to ask you as well is, who is a fish safe turbine for? And in other words, is it primarily to address the recovery of certain species like salmon, for example, or are you all really looking at it from the perspective of how can we make this work anywhere for any fish in any hydropower facility if possible?
We're really focused on the latter. And I think there it goes to maybe I'll ground it first in the fact that, again, we firmly believe that for the clean energy transition, hydropower needs to be part of the solution. It's also true that hydropower it's not called the forgotten renewable energy for like there's the real reasons why it's called that. And part of that has to do is one thing that contributes to that is the fact that the perception around hydropower's environmental performance is not as good as we think it could be. And there's perception, there's reality. They're not always the same thing, but at the same time, we firmly believe that if we design equipment that can make all hydropower able to be fish safe, that it's not going to solve all of the problems that we face in river ecosystem health, right? We've seen since the 70s, there's been something like a 70+% decline in freshwater biodiversity. That hydropower contributes to that, but it's definitely not the only factor. There are many, many stresses on our river systems globally. There's a lot of stuff that we have to tackle. We're not going to be the only solution, but we do think that with fish safe high performance equipment, we can with hydropower can reestablish a proud social license to operate as not just saying we're a reliable energy source, which we are, but that we are a responsible, reliable, sustainable energy source that is part of how we are going to, in some cases, recover ecosystems and recover species. That's absolutely a goal, very relevant in the Northwest, in both the Northwest and the Northeast, different species of concern. But also when we think about unlocking new build, that new build is now something that we can start because we know more now than we did 5, 6, 7 decades ago. So like, this isn't to say that what we did 5, 6, 7 decades ago was bad. We worked with what we had at the time, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't take advantage of things that we know now that would enable us to build projects in a different way that will work more sustainably with the river ecosystems. So and again, I always feel like I'm coming back to being like let's find solutions where we don't force ourselves into a false choice, where you must have one thing or the other thing, choose, and instead, like, let's use our brains, let's use our immense engineering capabilities and create solutions that help make the overall situation better.
In some ways, this might be a bit of a loaded question, although in other ways it may not be. And in full disclosure, have, at least to some degree, a little bit of an understanding myself of the answer to this question, but I think it's really important for our listenership in particular to better understand the answer to this question. Why is there a variation in the survival rate? In other words, it's 98 to 100%, I believe, is what I saw. Some people might look at that and have some questions about why isn't it 98? Why isn't it 100? Why isn't it 99? So on and so forth. So I'm curious just to kind of get a more detailed explanation of why we see a range of survival rates when it comes to fish passage.
So first and foremost, it's because, well, there are several reasons. So I will just list off several reasons. So one of them is different fish species have different levels of robustness. So for example, the test I mentioned where we were passing American eel that were as long as the test turbine was wide, which is kind of crazy, like pretty big fish for a very small turbine. We saw 100% survival rates, and which was absolutely not something that anybody standing on that test stand before who would just have come into it would have expected, because this turbine's spinning at hundreds of RPM. Like with a high-speed camera we can video it, but you can't see it with the naked eye. And eel are very robust. You couldn't put a bass that was as long as the turbine was wide through that turbine, and you wouldn't see the same result. And that's both the form factor and just the so that's something that matters. Different fish have different things that they're sensitive to. Then the second point also comes from what I just described, which is that the size of the fish relative to the characteristics of the turbine also matter. And bottom line is it's kind of intuitive. If I have a very small fish going through a massive turbine, that very small fish is going to have a better chance than a very large fish going through that same massive turbine, all things being equal. The next step is that different turbines spin, have different rotational speeds. And this is a technical thing, but basically there's a range in the fleet. And there are equipment where you see tip speeds that are like 40 meters per second, put that miles, you're like talking 70 miles per hour, like very, very fast. And then you have ones that are, spinning at half that or, a third of that. And so that's just like the natural variation of the equipment that's installed. And so that itself, again, fundamentally changes when we're designing replacements, they're just drop-in replacements. If I have a faster speed machine versus a lower speed machine, my lower speed machine is going to see a higher, probability. Like it's just when you look at the statistics, it is going to, by definition, perform better. So that's why. So there's several factors there that drive the range. Some of the factors being on the fish, and some of the factors being on the turbine and how that specific turbine is operated. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those things. I think just people see a number that isn't concrete, and it might be a little bit confusing, but I think it helps to better understand, for lack of a better term, the scientific process at what it takes to determine these numbers and understand. And they are so specific really to the individual project, the individual application, and obviously the species. And I think there was even a study that was produced not terribly long ago, I want to say by NOAA, and it described how the size, even among the same species of salmon smolt, even we could be talking about the same fish from the same hatcheries or, origin, just the size of them alone really determined their ability to survive passing through hydropower projects, either through a turbine or through a bypass system or a spillway weir of, any of the number of ways they can do so.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Size absolutely matters. And I mean, and this is where we often think what we're doing is kind of in the tradition of the kinds of engineering problems, frankly, that have been solved in transportation. Now, in that case, we were designing for high human passage, in automobiles and in airplanes. But if you, look back over a century, traveling in an automobile or traveling in an airplane used to involve a pretty substantial probability of mortality if you were a human being. And we have over time reduced that to a, where it's almost 100%. It's not 100% safe because we do have accidents. We do have, cases where there are injuries. And sometimes maybe when I frame it like that, it helps. We're not used to applying the same level of rigor necessarily to non-human species, but at the same time, it's not that different from an engineering process perspective, which is we want to achieve a survival rate. And so then what are the tools in our toolkit to help, how do we get to that point? But it is always going to involve some level of probability. It is just not a real world thing where you can say with certainty, because it's the real world and there are lots of different conditions that exist at any given point in time across many geographies and conditions, etc.
On a recent tour that I did of a federal hydropower project on the Columbia River, the engineers from the Army Corps were describing and explaining how the juvenile fish bypass system worked to divert the juvenile salmon or salmonids away from the intake so that they can then go into a bypass system and be redirected and offloaded at the base of the dam. And they were describing that some of the equipment that they use for these bypass systems is aging in such a way that it requires frequent repairs. It's become sort of a sore point or a sticking point for operations there, and that they actually are struggling in this post-pandemic world we live in to find a supplier for replacements for this equipment, but that they could do away with all of that by upgrading to a fish safe turbine. That in doing so, the need to have the bypass system functioning the same way is no longer necessary because of the high survival rate that those turbines offer. Are you seeing an increase in demand, or maybe a high demand from places, like the Northwest or others, for these retrofits and modernizations to take place and to have your fish safe turbines brought in to help with not only increasing fish passage and improving it, but also to help with some of these aging infrastructure needs that we're coming up against?
I mean, yes, absolutely. And I think again, it's geography and context dependent. But I think, our core thesis is that from a hydropower plant owner and operator's perspective, putting water through my turbines is what I want to do, because the more water I put through my turbines, the more energy I can generate, and the more consistently that I can do that year round, then again, my plant is then a better energy asset. And that's just because hydro is the fuel for my hydropower plant. So in general, and that's a core part of our thesis as well, which is that we can design high performance fish safe turbines, then the hydropower plant can be a hydropower plant, the folks who care about the energy side of it, but the hydropower plant can be a downstream safe fish passage device in and of its own right for when you look at it from a downstream fish passage perspective. And that is the simplest, most effective. So then, the energy side I've taken care of, but from the fish passage perspective, then that becomes the simplest, most effective way to get fish safely downstream, and to meet, the requirements often that folks are looking at from an environmental perspective is I want safe, timely, and effective downstream passage of fish. I don't want to have delays. I don't have them, to have a lot of handling, et cetera. And then from an operational cost perspective, it's same thing. I just run my hydropower plant, and I don't have to have other ancillary systems that I have to maintain, I have to clean, I have to operate, et cetera. So that is the reason why we have done our work. And I think in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of it, the demand is being driven by the fact that there is a wave of aging downstream fish passage equipment that has been put in place and is now about 20 years old, and is seeing what you just described. In other regions, it is really more the case that we are seeing new requirements being imposed for fish exclusion and bypass to address impacts to other species. And again, from a hydropower plant owner's perspective, that now is, additional CapEx I have to spend today. It's, OpEx to keep this cleaned and maintained over time. And in many cases, it's lost generation because now I'm putting water somewhere else instead of through my turbines. I'm being a bit simplistic, but for the purpose of just summarizing.
I greatly appreciate it. And I think, for the purpose of our discussion, it works perfectly to do so. As far as the discussion goes, fish passage is a big, big topic. And not only can it get really complicated really quickly, as we know, and there's a lot to cover, but it can also get pretty heated quickly. And there's a lot of controversy that comes into play, particularly as it comes to salmon recovery and hydropower and how we tackle these issues. The National Hydropower Association, American Rivers, and many others have tried to diffuse those conversations with something they call uncommon dialogue. And as I understand it, that's something that Natel has participated in. And so I'd really love if you could tell me more about how Natel was able to contribute to that dialogue and bringing some of those uncomfortable or unlikely conversations to the table.
Yeah, we're honored to be one of the founding participants in the Uncommon Dialogue, and we jumped at the opportunity to participate because I do think that the Uncommon Dialogue effort is it's exactly what we are trying to create solutions for, right? Where we can create solutions that work for rivers and work for power generation. In terms of and a lot of our approach to diffusing some of the discomfort is to acknowledge the fact that we do have harm. Like there is harm. Our river systems and ecosystems are not in as great shape as they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. That is a fact. And so, and then, okay, it's also a fact. We all like having a reliable grid. We all want to live in a world where when I go and turn, my lights on, that classic example that my lights turn on and second point, they don't flicker annoyingly. They just stay on because my frequency is like the grid frequency is maintained. So, okay, that's also a fact. So how do we, well, another fact, we are seeing a number of impacts as a result of changing climate. We are, we really do have a energy transition that we need to achieve. So with those things, then how do we rather than taking the approach of saying, I'm going to avoid the uncomfortable things because by saying any of those things are not true, instead, or attacking folks who might come at this from maybe just one perspective, but instead, okay, these are all true. How do we create solutions that then help create where all of the folks who come to the table with these different truths are able to see some benefit? And again, I go back to that kind of like helping to ground ourselves in a perspective of fairness. If you were in a situation where you were always told you have to lose, you would not feel very good and you would fight. and vice, again, maybe if you were in the situation where you were told you're always going to win, maybe you would, but I would bet somewhere in the back of your mind, the like elementary school ideals of like fairness would kind of like prickle a little bit, like maybe this isn't the right way it should be. And that, again, that we should think about how we can create solutions that work for the many as opposed to just for one interest.
Tying into that a little bit, retrofitting an existing project is an obvious fit for something like a fish safe turbine. But as I understand it, something that has been at least mentioned as part of the uncommon dialogue conversation, and I think is also just a really strong stance that we've seen coming from the National Hydropower Association, is the goal of identifying non-powered dams and adding generation to them in places where it is a really good fit. Do you see those as opportunities for fish safe turbines to be part of that retrofitting project to add generation to non-powered dams?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this kind of goes to our ethos that our design goal has been that you can design for high power performance and high fish safety at with no real trade-off in equipment cost. And so, from a from the economic perspective, then you look at it and it's just like, is this does my total cost to build this plant pencil out or not? So that's kind of like our at the end of the day, all of this has to work I think that's another strong philosophy we have. At the end of the day, like the economics have to work around the solutions that are actually going to be implemented at scale. And so, yeah, fundamentally, we say yes when we look at non-power dams. I do think that, non-power dams is an opportunity that the Department of Energy and the country has been focused on, for probably 2 decades at this point, at least a decade, certainly a decade and a half. And it is the fact that not all, like, it's expensive to build things generally in this country. It's gotten a lot more expensive over the last several decades. I think the economic conditions that are changing around whether or not some of those projects make sense is really actually just a fundamental shift in the underlying economics around electricity and energy in the country, which is, for several decades, we had no load growth effectively. And whereas now, literally over the last 2 years, we have gone from, there are multiple cases, IRP, utility rate cases across the country, where you can look a couple years ago and the load forecast was flat. And today the load forecast is 2-3%. Like, fundamental shift those are year-on-year numbers and like annual load growth, not. And so looking out all of a sudden over the next decade, we're in a situation where the dynamics around what we need to build and invest in have really changed. And they've changed because we're in a situation where we're not just trying to shift our generation mix to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but we also need to invest and build more generation across the board because we're just seeing, all of a sudden we're seeing a lot of load growth, and that load growth is, coming from kind of the splashy headline right now, of course, is AI and data centers, but it's also coming as we electrify a number of, things across our economy.
Well, and I'd love to understand, given your energy background, not only with Natel, but just in general, the different things you worked on over your career, sort of your broader take on where energy and specifically this clean energy future we talk about is headed.
Yeah, it's interesting because so fundamentally, it's always seemed to me, the idea of moving to a clean energy future that is grounded in renewable energy sources, so intermittent ones like wind and solar, more reliable or more like predictable ones like hydropower, baseload ones like geothermal, nuclear, etc. Like, that has all made sense to me from the perspective of particularly the ones that have natural fuel sources. Has always seemed to me like make obvious sense from the fact that if you can do that at scale, you as a country now have a very secure energy supply. And then if you can do that really efficiently and over time bring down the cost, that the go forward cost, like there's a big investment necessary to get to that point. But once you achieve that point, your marginal input of energy to produce an additional output of economic value is now like super predictable and cost effective. And that's a huge advantage for, any economy to be able to get to that point. So to me, the challenge we face for the energy transition is really about the trade-off, like the timing and is really about the timing of the investment decisions, and then tough trade-offs that have to be made as we transition that energy mix, because transitioning the energy mix, when you dig into what that means, it means like you're building more of some things and building less of other things. And so you need to evolve like workforce, and like there's a whole host of things that have to kind of happen to make that possible. So it's an incredibly complex challenge. It's the work of probably 2 generations, frankly. It's not something that I think it's appropriate to think about as like fast, simple, easy. Like the things that sometimes prickle my hairs are when people talk about the energy transition and they talk about it in terms of being fast and easy and cheap. And I fundamentally am like, well, if you were to tell anybody in like building something or projects in general, and they were like, I want it fast, easy, and cheap, and they'd be like, pick 2 of those things. Like you don't get all 3. And that I think that's just the hard reality that then feeds into the policy discussions around, how to do that. I think the end goal to me, seems like super worth doing, from an economic perspective, from an energy security perspective, from a sustainability perspective, and then the policy battles are around the fact that it's just the reality of life that I won't say maybe there are no things, but there are very, very few things that I'm aware of in life that are fast, easy, and cheap. Like maybe nothing. I don't know. Like you just like it involves trade-offs, or decisions and timing and yeah.
No, that's I think that is not only very, very true. It's very in line, I think, with what we've heard from so many different experts from all kinds of backgrounds. So nonetheless, I really do appreciate their perspective, as I think, it's always good to hear how different people in this industry with different backgrounds and different angles on things are looking at and approaching the challenges that we have ahead of us and where we need to go. When it comes to where people can learn more specifically about what Natel is up to, what you all are doing, and maybe even to some extent what your involvement is here with our challenges in the Northwest, specifically as it relates to the Columbia River Basin and salmon recovery and things like that. I know you mentioned people being able to go online and find some videos of your turbines in action and how they interact with fish, but what's the best place to send people if they want to learn more about this topic and learn more about Natel specifically?
Yeah. Just check out natelenergy.com, Natel energy.com. That's the website. And if, anybody wants to come and tour, we do a lot of testing here we're headquartered in the Bay Area in Alameda, California. We're happy to give tours, happy to, follow up with folks. And so, that's just info at natelenergy.com if you want to get in touch directly and learn a bit more directly.
Oh, that's really cool, because I've said many times when it comes to hydropower specifically, if people can go out and see some of this stuff in action in the field, specifically going to a dam or what have you and doing any kind of touring around there, it's always an awesome opportunity. And I think it's really exciting that people might have the potential to be able to do that for you as well. So really excited that those opportunities exist. And like you said, I hope people go and check out the website that you've got and see what info you have up there. As far as today's conversation, as we kind of come to the tail end of things, I also want to know too, is there anything that we didn't cover? Are there any shout outs you want to give? Anything that you want to kind of put out there to the world that maybe you're excited about that Natel's doing, or anything like that?
I mean, yeah, I just, want to, a couple shout outs. I do, deeply appreciate the work, of course, that your organization does, that NHA does, that IHA does. So the, trade industry organizations, both the US and internationally. the Department of Energy has been an incredible partner I think for the industry, really helping to and frankly stepping up the level of investment coming from the federal government to support the industry, not just through research and development on the technology side, but also through deployment and some of the programs that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. Our national labs are amazing. Like we have so many great resources in this country that I think really are benefiting the hydropower industry and will benefit. And then finally, I think the other last shout out, frankly, to the environmental community, American Rivers, and a number of organizations, environmental NGOs that we have the privilege to work with on a regular basis. I just also want to acknowledge that because I think it's, again, we all of us benefit from having clean air, clean water, healthy rivers, and I think sometimes in the heated battles that sometimes do happen project by project, we might lose sight of that these are organizations that are working on that and delivering things that we actually all benefit from, and I think it's important to shout that out too.
Well said. Very well said. And I think that leads us naturally to kind of the last portion of the podcast here, which I know you mentioned in kind of our pre-recording discussion, you had listened to a few episodes, so you may know this is coming, you may not. But either way, the thing that we try and do here is tell really two stories at the same time. So obviously we tell the story of what all of our guests come on here to talk about. And in that case today, we told the story of Natel and your fish safe turbines. But we also try and tell the story of the guests themselves and the people in our industry who are behind the scenes making energy and salmon recovery and hydropower and all these things happen. And the way we like to do that is to let our guests have the floor at the end of each podcast by giving us a little bit of advice and telling us something that is important to their daily lives or to their work or something that just guides them through what they're doing. And so the floor is essentially yours to give us something that is important to you and something that you want to share with our listeners.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's probably not a surprise, but or given the content of my comments in this podcast, but I do think that sometimes the values around being both quite objective about data and engineering and science, combining that with compassion and an ability to compromise, to me feel like core foundational common sense approaches to things. And sometimes I feel like that we've moved a little bit away from that. And so I think I just want to share that. I think that if we can ground ourselves in that, we can find good solutions. And it's been interesting for me that this has really been driven home now that I have a daughter, I have a 3-year-old, and I've always been motivated to work on climate and biodiversity. But it's true in some very strange way, like having a child has brought it home in a much more like emotional way as opposed to an intellectual way. And that's just, it's an interesting evolution for me over the last several years in terms of the lens through which I view my work, and care about my work.
And it is so important. I think it's definitely something that it's in the same way I think you described. It's easy for people to maybe overlook or take for granted the fact that when we turn our lights on, they come on, and that our grid is so reliable that we can really let it operate in the background and not pay attention to it. The same thing can definitely be said when it comes to that side of things as well. And yet, the guarantee is certainly not there. So I really appreciate that perspective, and I hope that our listeners will keep that in mind more often moving forward.
Yeah, we can work together. We absolutely can work together to create a better future for all of us. So
definitely, and we'll continue to do that from Northwest River Partners to Natel and as individuals to individuals. And I really appreciate you making the time and sharing this with our listeners today. It's such an important topic, and the work you all are doing is incredibly important to salmon recovery and ensuring that we create fish passage solutions that are durable and long-standing here in the Northwest. So appreciate the time, and we'll definitely be following up on more of this conversation in the future.
Thank you.
We're so excited to see what Natel and other leaders in the hydropower industry are doing to create win-wins for dams and fish. And I'm so excited that you all got to hear about all of it on the Dam podcast. I should also note some news regarding Gia and Natel, as shortly after recording this episode, it was announced that she would be transitioning into the role of Chief Commercial Officer and will remain on their board of directors, and that Bill Malice has been appointed as CEO. Since this podcast is airing after this announcement, I felt it was probably best to include that bit of information since we introduced her as CEO at Natel in the intro. All right, on to the usual wrap-up business. First, could you do me a favor? Open up your listening platform right now, or when you aren't working, driving, or doing something else that requires your attention, and leave us a 5-star review. Then subscribe to the podcast and turn on notifications to let you know when we release future episodes. You may already know that we upload every other Friday, but these actions boost DAM in the algorithm and help us reach new listeners. Now, if you want to engage with us, head on over to nwriverpartners.org and click or tap Contact Us in the top menu. You can let us know what you think of the podcast and tell us who or what you'd like to hear about next. You can also share comments, ask questions, and raise concerns that way. For those less web-savvy folks, just email us directly at info@nwriverpartners.org. Don't forget, by the way, to find us on the socials at NW River Partners on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. For those of you who listen to these upon arrival, I hope you had a great 4th of July and didn't become the victim of a firework-related accident. And until next time, see ya.